At last, with an 8.4-inch display and a 1600p resolution, I finally have a handheld with a screen worthy of playing the game of the year. HoloCure. What's good, gang? I'm Rich, this is FandaDeck, and today I am reviewing the AYANEO Qun. Ever since AYANEO said they were sending this over to me, thanks by the way to AYANEO, I started thinking of a few questions I couldn't wait to find the answer to, because on paper, this should be the closest thing to a Steam Deck. It has the right inputs to match with trackpads, gyro, and 4 back paddles, and in some ways it should be even better than a Steam Deck with a larger battery and a bigger screen. But then there's the eye-watering price tag and the fact that it runs Windows. So yeah, I had some burning questions like, do the inherent benefits of this monstrously sized handheld outweigh the drawbacks? Is there anything that sets this handheld apart enough to justify its price tag? How does Phantom Liberty look on this bad boy? Are the trackpads useful at all? And is that weird looking D-pad thing actually any good? So now that I have the Qun in my hands, these are the questions I'm going to answer in this review, among others. So far, I am impressed with the feel of this device, but before I tell you more about why, I should introduce the quote-unquote competition. We have so many devices now that it may be hard to keep track of what's out there, so here are some of the devices that I will reference throughout this video. The first is the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is still the only handheld that primarily runs an operating system that is designed to be focused specifically towards gaming. The other handhelds all run Windows by default. The Steam Deck also sets the bar for non-traditional controls like trackpads, gyro, and back paddles, so that is extremely relevant when comparing to this device. Alongside the Steam Deck, there are a few other handhelds that are very similar in terms of size, weight, and battery life. Those are the Asus ROG Ally and the AYANEO 2S. These devices make up this sort of mid-sized PC handheld market. The ROG Ally is actually sold in stores like Best Buy and is made by an established laptop manufacturer, Asus. In contrast, AYANEO is more of a boutique manufacturer specializing in handhelds specifically, and they sell their devices through crowdfunding campaigns on Indiegogo. If we take a step down in size, AYANEO also has the Air 1S. While something like the Air 1S is more portable, it does come with the downside of having a smaller battery and smaller screen compared to its big brothers. And today we're taking a step up in size from the Steam Deck and AYANEO 2S with the AYANEO Qun. It weighs 900 grams compared to the Steam Deck's 669. It has an 8.4-inch 1600p display as compared to the Steam Deck's 7-inch 800p display, and the battery on the Qun is nearly double the size of the Steam Deck's at 75 watt-hours compared to the Deck's 40. One thing I've said in my reviews of AYANEO devices in the past is that they do typically go for form first. Their handhelds have good functionality too, but it's clear that in the instances where they have to prioritize one over the other, they typically lean towards form over functionality. Given that, let's talk about the design, starting with what I love about it. I received the silk white version of the Qun, and I continue to be a fan of this sort of colorway that they have with the metallic gradient on the top side of the device. I find this to be a good balance between what is typically more in-your-face gamer aesthetic and the super sleek, super clean Apple look. It's generally sleek, but the gradient gives it a little bit of flair. In this case, the gradient goes from metallic blue to metallic green, with these two buttons here matching the look. Going back to the top of the device, all the standard stuff is here. There's finger sensor / power button, volume rocker, mic, power LED, a USB 4 port, and a USB 3.2 Type A port, with the ventilation taking up the final portion. Of course, you also have the top buttons up here. This includes the 2 bumpers, the 2 triggers, and these 2 mappable buttons that AYANEO calls LC and RC. On the bottom is another USB 4 port in the center, and it's flanked on either side by dual vents and down-firing speakers. There's also a second microphone and a 3.5mm headphone jack down here. Moving to the back of the device, we do have 2 new additions for AYANEO. The first is the kickstand here, which hides the port for the SD card just like the Switch. Plus, this is the first AYANEO I know of with back buttons, and in this case we have 4 just like the Steam Deck: RC1, RC2, LC1, LC2. I'll get into those later. And then on the front, we have the remainder of the inputs, starting with two new things at the top left, a guide button and a webcam. On the top right, you have an AyaSpace button. Going down from there are dual asymmetrical Hall sensor analog sticks, this floating D-pad thing, ABXY face buttons, dual trackpads, start and select buttons on the bottom left, and two Aya buttons on the bottom right. One of these is actually another AyaSpace button just like on the top right, and the other is the show desktop button. Now that I've gotten all of that out of the way, let me tell you what immediately jumps out to me when I hold this thing in my hands. And it's going to be of no surprise to you because I'm sure it also jumped out at you just when you first saw the device. I'm referring, of course, to the trackpads. The trackpads sit incredibly low. It does feel like I can stretch to the shoulder buttons, but I can already imagine that this would be awkward for playing first-person shooters or anything that requires real-time input. I figure the trackpads are only going to be useful for navigating windows or maybe playing turn-based mouse games like Civilization or Baldur's Gate. Another place where it feels like Aya chose form over function is that Aya button on the top right. As I mentioned, it does the exact same thing as the Aya button on the bottom right. When it comes to aesthetics, it does make the device look nicer, more symmetrical, but it does seem strange to have such a redundant input here. Now, in practice, most of the traditional controls feel quite good. The face buttons are on the small side and comparable to the Steam Deck buttons. Personally, I would have liked larger buttons. I find the large buttons on the Ally to be nice and luxurious, for example. Unlike the AYANEO 2 or the Air 1S, the face buttons here are completely away from the analog sticks and they never really interfere. The D-pad is much better than it looks. I'd go as far as to say, if you use a D-pad casually, like most people do, it's actually quite good. When I play Celeste, I can easily hit each of the 8 directions I'm intending to hit, including the diagonals. It sort of rolls around on the pivot, and there are these indentations that help you hit diagonal directions intentionally. But it does appear as though fighting games tell a bit of a different story. There's this move I've been using lately to test D-pads, and fighting game players may recognize it as one of the first combos you learn when you play virtually any Street Fighter game. It's a crouching medium kick canceled into a Hadouken. Ryu can do this in virtually any Street Fighter game, and it's one of the first combos you learn almost instinctively. On any normal controller, it's a trivially easy combo, but for some reason it's harder to pull off on the D-pads that are being used in most handhelds. I found that to be true here as well. It seemed as though the down right diagonal in particular had a hard time registering as I was rolling from down to right. This was alleviated when I focused more on rolling the D-pad rather than rolling my thumb on the D-pad. Hopefully that makes a little sense, but it still doesn't come as naturally to me as it does on the 8-bit Do or as it does on any DualShock controller, so that may be something to look out for. Next up, we do have to talk about how the trackpads play in practice. Now, as I'm recording this, there is still software that is missing when it comes to configuring the trackpads, but there is still a lot I can tell you about the quality of them. First of all, I actually love that the trackpads are inset and circular like they were on the Steam controller. That actually feels a lot better to me than the Steam Deck trackpads. Secondly, the haptics are amazing, much better than they are on the Steam Deck as well. Those are a couple areas where I came away impressed with the trackpads. Unfortunately, I didn't really find them to be usable for first-person shooters. The positioning makes it awkward to press the shoulder buttons. Even the back buttons are harder to press from this position. But also, like I said, there's a bunch of software that's currently still missing, so I can't really fine-tune the sensitivity or anything like that. As a result, I just couldn't find a good sweet spot for aiming. If you compare me playing Cultic on the Cune to me playing Dread Templar on the Steam Deck, my play is a lot better on the deck. I even tried a point and click game as well, and honestly my experience with that was also not so great. I felt like I was fighting with the controls the entire time. In addition to using the right trackpad for aiming, you can use the left trackpad as a scroll wheel. You can scroll both vertically and horizontally, so that's nice, and then both trackpads are pressable in 4 areas, so that's 4 more buttons that you have access to. The left trackpad buttons are mapped to the arrow keys, and the right trackpad is a little bit funny. Both the down direction and the left direction are mapped to the normal left click of the mouse. The right direction is mapped to a right click, but the up direction is mapped to the enter key. Enter key often ends up acting like a left click anyway, so it kind of means that in 3/4 of the area where you're going to press down, you'll effectively get a normal click, which is probably what you want These pressable areas did cause some problems for me. It takes very little force to activate them, and that caused some major misfires when I was playing Cultic. I recorded some footage where it would mistakenly activate the alt fire using the right click and basically empty my clip immediately. That is a major problem, and if the software was ready, I guess I would have to deactivate this option entirely, which I don't think is what I want. Likewise, even if you're not intending to use the trackpads, they do sit right where your palms would go, and that definitely causes some issues too. Ideally, there would be better palm rejection so that it doesn't register an unintentional touch, but yeah, that's not the case right now. Once again, there will be, or in this case more precisely, there is now an update to disable this in software, but unfortunately I am unable to update to the latest version of AyaSpace. I would love for AYANEO to keep at it because there are things that I like about the trackpads, but I think the software has a long way to go. Thankfully, it's still in a pre-release state, and perhaps they can resolve these issues before units start shipping, but it's clear that something like this is going to take some time to get right. On that note, the AYANEO Qun, just like other AYANEO devices, has onboard gyro that can be configured using Aya's own software. The configuration options for gyro aren't nearly as plentiful and robust as the options in Steam Input. In fact, the only thing this gyro will do is emulate the right analog stick. I can't really overstate that Steam Input has dozens of individual ways to configure gyro, and as of right now, there are only 2 configurable options in AyaSpace. One is the sensitivity with 3 possible values: low, medium, high, and the other is which button you're going to hold to enable gyro, and that only has 2 possible values, either LB or LT. Again, I'm glad someone else is attempting to do something like this, but this is going to be pretty challenging to catch up with Steam's offering. I attempted to use gyro with Cultic, and once again the results felt clumsy. There appeared to be a large unconfigurable dead zone, and it was easier to move up and down compared to left and right. Similar to trackpads, if you compare me using gyro on the Steam Deck, you probably wouldn't even realize I'm using gyro, but here I had to make large, clumsy movements for it to register, and overall the experience was pretty awkward for me. Thankfully, there should be another option. The developers of a Windows app handheld companion can theoretically help bridge the gap. What they've done with other AYANEO devices is take all the requisite parts and present them to Windows as a DualShock or DualSense controller. They should theoretically be able to do the same for the Qun, and if so, then the gyro and trackpads may become configurable in Steam Input, just like a DualShock controller. Moving on from the controls, I do have to talk about the display next. So this is sort of the biggest handheld I've been sent. I say sort of because I was also sent a 1X Player 2, which is approximately the same size, but it was an early prototype unit and it had issues, so I never really got to see it in its full glory. I say all of that to say, this is the first time I've had extended play sessions with an 8.4-inch display on a handheld, and it does feel kind of insane in a good way. I'll talk about the drawbacks of such a large handheld as well, but this screen feels downright luxurious. There isn't a game that doesn't benefit from the extra size. Many games on the PC can still have relatively small text, and then there are games like Baldur's Gate where there are a lot of details that you might lose on a smaller screen. Now, I understand that everyone is different in that respect. There are plenty of folks out there that even enjoy PC gaming on a 5.5-inch screen, like on the AYANEO Air Plus. For me, I'm someone that even though I end up feeling like the AYANEO Qun is a little too big for my taste, I absolutely love the size of the screen. Even playing older games like Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, the bigger screen brings me closer to that classic arcade experience. As I mentioned before, the resolution is 1600p, and for newer AAA games, you probably shouldn't run at that native resolution, but that's to be expected. I'll cover more about performance later on in this video too, but sticking to the display, there's also the color range and brightness. I think the range of color on the screen is really good and generally comparable to other AYANEO handhelds, which have traditionally been very colorful, pleasantly saturated, and typically just a joy to look at. This is a 500 nit screen, which is fairly standard, but it doesn't get nearly as dim as the Steam Deck for those folks that care about being able to play with really low brightness. Moving on to the audio, I mostly play with earbuds, but I will say the speakers here are a step down from either the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally, and that's especially true on the high end. I noticed it when comparing Celeste as well as the theme for the main screen of Street Fighter Anniversary Collection. Both of these have some high notes that come off as harsher on the Qun compared to those other handhelds. The speakers also seem to have overall less depth. I'm not an audiophile, so the best way for me to explain it is that I feel like I can hear more of the separate tracks on the Steam Deck and the Ally, whereas on the Qun, they all kind of blend together. I will say that the Steam Deck and the Ally both have really immaculate speakers, so it's not a surprise to see any device fall below those two, but given the price tag of the Qun, I'm kind of looking for everything to be top of the line, and I don't know if that's an unreasonable expectation from me, but I know that's how I feel, and I suspect that's how many of you feel as well. One of the most important things to address about the AYANEO Qun is the size. When I reviewed its little brother, the Air 1S, I mentioned that a small size has some inherent benefits and drawbacks. It probably goes without saying that the same is true for large handhelds too. In fact, the weaknesses of the Air 1S are the strengths of the Qun. In particular, the battery life on this guy is incredible given the fact that it has a 75 watt-hour battery. That's nearly double what's in the Steam Deck. The max TDP of the Qun, of course, is much higher than that of the Steam Deck, ROG Ally, or even AYANEO 2S, but as I'm going to show in a little bit, a TDP of 54 watts comes with incredibly diminishing returns. So in practice, I typically kept the TDP at 25 watts or below. That said, another benefit of a large handheld is a large display, and I've already described how luxurious that is. Probably the final inherent benefit of a large handheld is the heat dissipation. With a chassis of this size, there's a lot of room to optimally push heat outside of it. Certainly that is evident when you observe CPU temps, as they do stay cool the entire time, but there is at least one hot spot to be aware of. This kickstand is made of metal, and as a result, it gets particularly hot. You won't burn yourself with an accidental touch, but you won't want to leave your finger there regardless. It's out of the way of a normal holding position, but still, it seems like a design oversight to let this get as hot as it does, and it once again feels like Aya chose form over function in this instance. Finally, with regard to heat dissipation, the fan isn't particularly loud, especially given the TDPs this thing can push, but the fan is whiny and extremely noticeable. This for me just felt like another reason to not push the TDP above 25 watts or so. From a performance perspective, I do have some interesting results. So I used a few of the same games I typically use, which are Batman Arkham Knight, Phantom Liberty, Returnal, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. For each of these tests, I would run the benchmark and run them 3 times and average out the results. And I made a few different comparisons. So let's start with the AYANEO Qun at 20 watts versus the One X Fly at 20 watts. Both of these devices have the 7840U, so the results should be comparable, and in some instances they are, right? So Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Returnal both have virtually the same FPS. The One X Fly gets a slight advantage in Phantom Liberty, but it's Arkham Knight that is really weird. So Arkham Knight, I get 53 FPS on the One X Fly, and I get 44 FPS on the AYANEO Qun, so it's a lot lower for the Qun than the One X Fly. I'm not sure what was the cause of this, but it was very, very consistent. Aside from that, I wanted to see what you get from 54 watts on this device, so I just compared AYANEO Qun 20 watts to AYANEO Qun 54 watts, and I'm going to say the results were pretty surprising. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you get a jump from 38 to 42. For Returnal, you get a jump from 26 to 29. For Arkham Knight, you get a jump from 44 to 47. And oddly, for Phantom Liberty, you get a decrease from 37 to 35. Honestly, even if you ignore the decrease there for Phantom Liberty, which I assume is just an anomaly, even though it was consistent as well, I think the increase you get in the other games is just not large enough to justify more than doubling the power throughput. We took the TDP from 20 watts to 54 watts, and in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, that frame rate only jumped by 10%. That's just not enough of a benefit to me to justify the increase in power throughput. For me, the sweet spot really is 20 watts, and that's what I'm going to stick to. And with a battery of 75 watt hours, that's going to give you much more battery life than you're going to get on the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally anyway. When it comes to navigating Windows on an AYANEO device and AYANEO's software called AyaSpace, I really don't have too much new to say. If you watch my video review for their last device, the Air 1S, that really covers a lot of it. Overall, I think the software is good. There are ways to control the TDP, to limit the FPS, to show a performance overlay. There's also a panel in the menu to control the brightness, the volume, turn on airplane mode, that sort of thing. And then they have a series of options for configuring the controls. You can change the sensitivity of the triggers, the sensitivity of the joysticks. You can enable gyro, do things like that. Overall, it is really ambitious software. They're trying to do a lot here, and they're trying to catch up with what the Steam Deck has on offering. I think the places where it's lacking the most are obviously the configuration options for Trackpad. They just don't exist yet, but those should be coming soon. But then more importantly, the configuration options for Gyro. I would expect those to be a lot further along, a lot more robust by now. Gyro is not an easy problem to solve, but there are a lot of good resources out there for developers that want to write software that handles gyro. Things like the Gyro Gaming Wiki provide a standard for what to expect, and honestly, that standard has just not been met on these devices so far. I will point Aya to these resources because I do think they care and they do keep getting better every time. So hopefully this is something that they can incorporate in future versions. But outside of that, I think AyaSpace has been continuing to get better. And again, that is really evident with the ability to set the TDP, set the FPS limit, have a performance overlay, things like that. So I'd just like to see them continue to build on that in future versions. Alright, I want to give you my final thoughts on the AYANEO Qun, but I can't do that without talking about the price. So the cheapest you can possibly get this device for is $999. That is the early bird price for the lowest configuration you can get, which is 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage. That is a lot to ask for, and whether or not it is worth it is really going to be up to you. But here's what I'll say. Overall, I am really impressed with the display of the AYANEO Qun and the battery life, and I think those two features can go a long way if that's what you're in the market for, right? You're not going to be able to find a better handheld if what you're looking for is a really big display, a really big battery, and the best APU you can get today. On the other hand, if you're looking at this device because it has input parity with the Steam Deck, well, I would suggest that you hold off. The back buttons work reasonably well, but the trackpad and gyro do still have some work to be done before they're really up to par. Still though, I'm excited that this handheld exists. First of all, I love that someone else is working on trackpads, and I do think it's going to get better as they continue to iterate on the software. Second of all, it is kind of nice if you're someone that can afford the 64 gigabytes of RAM and 4 terabytes of storage. With 4 terabytes, you just really wouldn't have to worry about space, so I can see the benefit there. But let me know what you think of all of this. Do you think this size is something that is attractive to you? Do you think that all of this justifies the price tag? Definitely let me know in the comments. I hope you're all having a wonderful week, and until next time, Deck Gang out. Goodbye.